Okay, I think I did it. And let me just report it. Okay. Great. Well, welcome everyone to our Group E. Let's see here. To our Group E session for the SCI-Arc reviews. I'm David Eskenazi, one of the faculty here at SCI-Arc, one of the thesis advisors as well. I'll be the host for our session today. We have 4 students we're going to see: Richard Mapes, HIRAL AHIR, ERWIN VEGARA, and we're going to start with WANGSHU CHEN in just a minute. I wanted everyone to maybe introduce themselves. Our thesis advisors today are myself and Jackie. Jackie, do you want to say hi?
I wasn't ready for that. Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Bloom. I'm advising HIRAL AHIR today. I've been teaching at SCI-Arc for quite a while now. I'm coordinating 2A this semester and quite excited actually with the kind of new format, looking into it for like great opportunities. And I just want to say thank you to all the students for working so hard this semester. I know it's been a little bit difficult at times, but I think there have been some really amazing things that I've been seeing coming out of this whole process. So good luck to everyone.
Our other thesis advisor with us is Margaret Griffin. Margaret, do you want to say hi? You're muted.
Hi, I'm Margaret Griffin. I have 2 thesis students today, WANGSHU and ERWIN. And yeah, super excited to be starting school again. I've been at SCI-Arc about 15 years now. And nice to see everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Cool, and we'll ask our guests that are here to introduce themselves too, and I think we'll be joined by a few more as we get going throughout the morning. Laida, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Sure. Hi, I'm Laida Aguirre. I am an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, where I'm currently calling from. I have a practice called Stock Studio, and you already know that I'm recently more into plants.
Thank you for joining us from Michigan. How's the weather in Michigan these days? Is it okay?
It's a beautiful day. My door is open, and yeah, things are cute. I also have a new puppy, and he might be bugging us at some point.
Perfect. Great.
I'm assuming we'll welcome that distraction.
And then we were also joined by Kivi. Do you want to introduce yourself? I think you're muted. Let me unmute you. Here you go.
Here we go. Yes, I am Kivi. I'm joining you from Helsinki, Finland, about 8 p.m. at the moment.
Oh, wow.
And LA used to be my home. I used to be a professor at UCLA, but almost 10 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been so long, but I moved back and I run my studio, Atelier Sotaama from Helsinki, and haven't been involved in academia for a few years. It's fun to be here with you virtually.
Well, thank you for joining us and giving us your evening for the review. So we'll ask all the students to turn off their cameras until they present. So I'm going to ask Richard, HIRAL, and I guess Erwin already turned his camera off because we're going to start with WANGSHU. WANGSHU, you ready?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, take it away. We are ready for you.
Okay. I sent a Twitch link on the chat, so please click that one. Okay. Hi, my name is WANGSHU from Mark 1, and my thesis topic is Diary of the Undiscovered Theater, and I'm going to play a video.
Welcome to the famous movie capital, Los Angeles. Take a look at these gorgeous theaters and movie shops with a wide variety of goods, and the avenue of stars full of movie posters and star signatures, all of which show the city's strong film culture. Look at the huge logo standing on the mountain in the distance, telling us that this is the world's film industry center, Hollywood. Wait a minute, we seem to have come to the wrong place. The place we actually want to go is not Hollywood, but South Broadway, the birthplace of Los Angeles movies. Broadway is a major thoroughfare in central Los Angeles, Southern California. Broadway from 3rd to 9th Streets in the historic core was the city's main commercial street from the 1910s until World War II. It is also the location of the Broadway Theater District, the first and largest historic theater district listed on the National Registry of Historic Places. With 12 movie places located along a 6-block stretch of Broadway, it is the only large concentration of movie palaces left in the United States. This corner, which is across from the Bradbury Building, is not only famous in the history of the city, but it is also famous in the cinematic expression of the city, appearing in such iconic movies like Blade Runner. We can all picture this, yet each of our pictures is different. This theater is currently literally an unoccupied void in the city. It is the definition of defunct void in the city. In this thesis, I propose to remake the defunct $1 Million Theater in downtown Los Angeles on Broadway by adding 2 new state-of-the-art cinemas that float above, defying gravity, like thought clouds of abstraction, simultaneously real and imaginary. This, combined with a new elevation of the magnificent yet unoccupied and defunct theater, creates an unexpected new space in the city to animate its future. This proposal literally cuts into the existing theater, unearths a ruin to be taken over by a wild garden, becoming a new public space. The building is a new combination of the past and the future. Time evolves at different rates. My project seeks to remake this iconic yet defunct theater with a new urban intersection, including systems of evolving nature of the city, evolving time, and by rebuilding a new iconicity in a manner that is unpredictable, variable, and has vitality in the city. So my proposal is reanimate it through its unexpected excavations, and the floating cinemas creates a new wilderness that reconnects to the public sequence of space in the city through the interior of an unused block, creating a public sequence of spaces in conversation with the Bradbury Building, and proposes a continued future in cinematic expression.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
WANGSHU, do you want to show maybe stop on an image that we can look at, or is there a Miro board or something that we can look at?
Okay.
WANGSHU, I'm interested in this kind of dialectic in a way that you've set up with the kind of like unpredictable iconicity. Can you tell me a little bit more about like what would you mean by that? Like what's unpredictable, and which kind of assets of your project will you tie to like the word icon? Like which ones tied to the icon, which ones go to the unpredictable, if we were to make sort of two columns?
Well, for the iconic, because this the old theater is named $1 Million Theater. It is the first theater in downtown Los Angeles and can be regarded as the start of the film industry of downtown Los Angeles, not Hollywood. So, but now this theater is abandoned. So I'm going to rebuild a more different style new theater on top of the old one and make them into a new combination, and that they can be a new iconic to that historic district. So this is the word iconic.
Would you say the unpredictable is the wild garden?
Well, the wild garden is in the old theater because it's abandoned. So I'm going to make the outside, the people from the outside can look inside. Because when you're walking on the street, you don't know that there is an old theater inside that. So hold on, please. So I make a big hole here to make people can see inside, to make them know that there is a wild garden inside, and it used to be an old theater.
I mean, I love your question, Laida, because when I look at the images that you've produced, WANGSHU, like there's something that stands out to me about the kind of blackness of everything with almost no context except for the buildings that you've altered. And it seems like the sense of something that which would be I forgot the word already, but whether it's unexpected or strange would be something that you wouldn't currently doesn't really feel like it, because in some ways it's almost that the image itself is the project. Like it almost has become the opposite of like a black hole. Like it's like black and then the thing itself emerges. And in that sense, it makes me think that your city is much more about, or like the way that it changes our sense of expectations and iconicity is in some ways very much about its kind of effects on its surroundings, in the sense that it could, at least in your ambitions of these images, like blur out all of the things around it, right? Like make everything else dark and almost make the whole city seem almost to some extent insignificant, I guess, because the project is so important. And that's something that I'm very curious about, because it seems strange to in some ways have a project, and I'd be curious to hear more about this, have a project which is very much about existing buildings, right? The way that you've like carved in, you've pushed in, you've hidden a thing, and yet be so kind of, at least in its imagery, trying to hide so much of the other context, the rest of the city, let's say. And so there's this like funny, I think, kind of contradiction between those two things, between wanting to engage the city and wanting to engage kind of some of the existing architecture, and then never showing the full sense of the city itself. It's almost kind of producing a kind of island in a sense, which is, I'm not sure exactly the intention, but it's certainly the effect that at least I see in the way that you've constructed these images for today, which are quite beautiful, by the way.
Yeah, I think in some way it seems like a lot of maybe your time and effort were spent on the sort of like more formal aspects of the project, yet the rendering kind of foregrounds, like if like there's a certain kind of noirness, right, to your project. I think maybe because like the whole city is dimmed. It's got, and like if I were to continue with the kind of idea of the word icon, like in your your kind of icon parallel would be like the only like lit like street light in a noir movie, right? Like you have, it has that kind of like if it's going to be an icon, it's that icon. But it's like the fact that there's like a kind of wild garden underneath like a single street light. It's got that kind of power of the kind of like urban poetics, if you will, that get involved in like films, like the kind of noir genre. I think that's what makes it iconic, almost like more than the formal strategies that you've deployed. So that's why I was asking you, like, where did you put your weight of the idea of the icon, which to me it's like now fully on the rendering, and on how you chose to handle light, and the fact that all of the wild garden was lit from above. Like that's in itself like an incredible effect, more than the kind of formalisms, which are perhaps more in their attempt to be iconic. They're now more familiar to us, and maybe this is one of the shortcomings of talking to like a jury of architects, right? Like it is that like certain icons are no longer iconic to us, and certain effects are chased dearly after, and now become sort of like the icons that we perhaps chase after. So this could be like an intradisciplinary, extradisciplinary conversation itself, where you would get a completely different wow effect from a jury that's compiled of known architects, and they might be sort of like, you know, lusting after your formal strategies.
I'm curious, Laida, like what I love about this image in particular, and I assume it's a plan, is the black hole that appears again on the interior of this plan. It's almost like this kind of, I suppose it would sort of reproduce the exterior idea of iconicity, or at least of removal of what's around it, and sort of having this like figure that stands out on the interior, right? Like that, I think the auditorium there, I assume would also be figured in such a way, or would stand out against the rest of the interior, and also produce like a kind of this dichotomy on the inside of the architecture, which I actually think is kind of interesting and something we don't often think of when we think of words like icon. We don't often think of interiors, we think of exteriors, I suppose. And so I don't know, I like that there's that kind of possibility to it. It's pretty interesting.
We also don't, yeah, there's also something like playing with positive, negative, where we rarely think about an icon that is a void. So if an interior void as an icon is like a sort of a multiple oxymoron, perhaps an oxymoron, but an interesting one regardless, right? That one could make, what are the sort of the sinkholes that are all over Mexico? The
cenotes.
I'll think of the cenotes, yeah. Yeah, this would be sort of like the architectural equivalent of like a cenote to like.
Yeah, I love that. I love these observations about your project, because now I'm starting to imagine your project in different ways, and how you might even start to capitalize on the kind of black and white noir effect, and how that might start to make you think about how do you then, you know, you use color for your greenery, but I wonder, like, you know, when in black and white films, when they try to colorize them, they're using digital color effects, but starting with the black and white image. And I wonder if that would have produced a different effect in producing maybe color and materiality on the interior of your project. And I like that possibility. And I think these images kind of start to show that. And I agree that the noir representation almost acts like a kind of like a white model. Like if you were to build this as a physical model and build it all in white, it has a way of sort of allowing us to see the project not for its sort of rendered wow effect, but for the things that reside just sort of on the periphery of form making. So all of the things like voids and the fact that this might be in a project about the inside and not really about the outside, like those kinds of things start to come to the foreground that I think are really interesting here.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder, WANGSHU, if you could tell us more about why the city is rendered so absent in the project about iconicity, which seems to be about, or at least the way we traditionally think of it, is about its relationship to the city. Could you tell us more about why not show any of it?
You mean this drawing or?
This drawing or some of the other drawings, you know, like in all of them, it's very kind of isolated in a sense.
Well, because the old city is a historical area, so I want to make this new theater into a very different icon between different icon from the other buildings, because the old city is in Spanish colonialism style. So I want to make a new kind of style architecture to stand in that corner and make this city a new look of the from the old one.
Could you go back to like, I think it's more of a perspective or like an elevation,
Okay.
right? Yeah, see, in these images where you do see the city and it's so present, it does make one wonder about how different something needs to be to produce, I guess, a sense of difference or a sense of iconicity. For sure, it's something that one would remember in its context, but I'm not sure whether or not this, like its kind of inwardness on the ground level is then totally changed by its outwardness up on the roof, right? Like you've pushed in and like sucked in the building once you see it from other views down at the bottom. And at the top, it's more of like a brain that's like exploded out of our heads or something. I think that it's so strange because on the interior, it's almost the opposite. Like the sense of sucking in is actually quite interesting for architecture, to sort of think of a building presence at ground level of something removed actually away from the street. And the top of the building in some ways is a little bit familiar in the sense of like producing a large figure at the top, which, as you can see, in the context, all of the buildings have some kind of raked figure at the top of it. But I think the thing that seems interesting to me is that the bottom of your building is quite different than all those other buildings, right? Like they all have this kind of boundary condition, and then you've like sucked in. That's pretty, I think, pretty interesting, and I think one of the discoveries of the thesis probably.
I wonder, WANGSHU, you also, like, not in this image, but prior, I'm thinking back at the plan that you showed, sort of maybe, I don't know what story, which story it was, but the plan that you were showing earlier, you have sort of like a competing geometry in terms of like how you make the void. There was a part of me that was anticipating that you were going to use this sort of roundedness of your like, the kind of blimp-like quality, that you were going to kind of parallel that on the interior void, on the sort of like plan geometry of the interior void. Can you tell us more about why you didn't? Because in some way it seems like that could have been fertile ground for you to take advantage of that roundedness for like novel ways of image projection or sort of experiential, going towards the experiential, but instead this kind of the geometry kind of regularizes it onto something that might be following a logic of staircases and cores and things that are slightly more within a language of like that kind of like more mundane architecture that you don't seem to be following. So I'm curious about why the kind of the form, the softness and the roundedness of the exterior is contrasted by that interior voids geometry and plan.
Okay. Well, because the old $1 Million Theater, it's a very regular shape. It's an L shape and consists of two rectangle shape architecture part. And I want to make a contrast between them. So I use a round shape to make the whole building carve into that. And the inner side is I want to create another view of the different shape in the inside. So I use named Tyson rectangle and make it into 3D and make them carved into my project, so they can create different layers like regular, irregular, and another irregular shape. So make it into 3 layers.
Okay, I have a little bit of difficulty in addressing the project. So if you bear with me, I think it's very exciting. But I wonder, could you state in simple terms what the topic of research or thesis is? Is it the production of icon, the means for the production of icon, and your attempt to contribute something new to the history of architecture in terms of the architectural devices by which you produce that effect?
Well, the topic of my thesis is to make people remember that there was an old theater here, and because the old theater is forgotten, it's abandoned. Nobody uses that cinema anymore. So I want to create a new cinema to make them into a new one and make people remember that there were the first theater in Los Angeles was there and is still be used.
Okay, but how would you formulate that in terms of architectural discourse and theory? I mean, I gather in the thesis, you're expected to form a position in terms of contemporary architecture and issues in contemporary architecture. So what the descriptions sound quite specific, and everybody's discussing different exciting discoveries and properties of the project. But I wonder if you're able to articulate the research and the discourse around the project in terms of contemporary architecture. Or is it unfair? Is it an unfair question? That's my reading of the thesis, the way that it's described, was that you're required to, basically, in addition to doing the work, you are required to, at least afterwards, examine the work for its results and then discuss it in those terms. So, for example, when you discuss the production of difference, it would be interesting to, the project looks in many ways quite familiar in terms of the techniques that it uses in the production of difference. It looks like a lot of the 60s projects. People mention things like blimps or archigram projects and so on. And I think the discussion of the void as an icon, that sounds like a thesis that's very exciting. But I had difficulty from the way that you describe the project, understanding or evaluating whether you actually understand exactly what you've achieved or have not achieved, and what's the criteria against which I should try to evaluate the success of the project?
Well, I want to remake the theater through excavation and through removal. My connect the theater to the city. So that is why I want to make it an iconic one. So
Well, I understand, but first, so you want to produce an icon?
yeah.
Yes. Okay. So in the history of contemporary, in the history of architecture, or within contemporary architecture, how is your approach, your methods of producing an icon? What have you discovered that's unique, and where are you standing on somebody else's shoulders, or where is it that you're learning from somebody else? I mean, this is what I'm getting at. Like, where's the potential contribution in terms of that particular topic? I mean, I'm bugging you just because it's a thesis and it seems to be set up that way. Or somebody interrupt me if I'm out of line and it's not what's being expected of the students.
I don't think you are, but I would just say that I understood WANGSHU that it wasn't only about an icon, it was about remaking this existing condition and then adding to it. So I understood that it was more duality in your intention, but I don't hear you saying that.
Oh.
It's like a yeah, it's a kind of like it shares a strange, like a interesting diagram between a preservation project through like, you know, radical iconicity or something, you know, like through, like, how could you do like preservation through, like, by putting a billboard on something that looks exactly different or something, you know.
That's interesting. Well, you're doing his job now.
Yeah.
I think it's a valid question, Kivi. I mean, maybe the question, WANGSHU, is like, is the idea of iconicity relevant anymore? It was definitely relevant, and, you know, kind of top news, right, in architecture for a while. But when you bring it up now, it does seem a little bit dated to be talking about iconicity. But because you're relating it to a kind of remaking of an existing condition, there's an opportunity there to kind of shift the way we would typically think of iconicity in architecture. And so maybe that's where, you know, you might start to think about where your project can answer some of those questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
I wonder if, well, I was just thinking as you guys were saying that, like, I just wonder if there's something also to be said about the context, you know, in Los Angeles at the scale that one works at, that your project is working at also, in terms of like what produces an icon and its relevance. You know, like, for example, it's not like the biggest building, it's sort of a bit smaller, which I think is kind of interesting to have that discussion at that scale. And it's also not something that's going to be super visible from like totally another part of the city, which is, again, maybe sometimes how we think of these things to some extent. but it will be present, I guess, in that kind of area. So I don't know if that makes a big difference too, like just the scale, the context of Los Angeles, et cetera, how that sort of affects even your position as you move forward on this question after thesis. And you're trying to kind of like confront some of these questions long term. I don't know.
Yeah, that also seems to bring the like Jackie's folds in Jackie's comment too. Like what are iconic qualities now? Like would it be, yeah, brightness? Like does it have really good Wi-Fi? You know, like maybe I don't, you know, like that, like does it offer, like can is it just because you can see it from afar? Is it because it like provides you know, like, because it's certainly not producing, you know, like would it matter if it produced something really good to look at in a brochure, right? Like, or like in a, not from a tourism aspect, if we're considering this kind of particular moment. So I like that also the wildflowers kind of can potential in the idea of the void as icon, like all of these things can provide options for you. You've given yourself a few options in terms of like doing a kind of matrix of analysis of like what is iconic. Is it, you know, is it something that you can walk on? Is it something that you can see from far? Is it something that offers a service? Is it something that so I think you have a few things in your project that you could do a second sort of like another pass at like, well, what is it that I've created and what am I attaching the word icon to? Like, is it, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, WANGSHU. Are there any final comments from anyone? If there aren't, I think we will say congratulations on finishing your thesis and presenting. And if it's okay with Erwin, we will start a little bit early. Is Erwin still here? We're going to move on to the next student. So thank you, WANGSHU.
Thank you.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then, thank you. Erwin, are you ready?
Yes.
Great. Why don't you take over? Erwin is also advised by Margaret, so we'll keep going. Great.
Thank you, David. Hi guys, I'm Erwin. The title of my thesis is Stacks on Stacks on Stacks. It's I have an animation here that I'm going to play for you guys. Okay. This thesis introduces the strapping topology as a formal exercise and explores the case of hoarder assemblage through the drawer, the stack, and the strap, borrowing from Jekyll and Ramey's You Can't Lay Down Your Memories. The building's program is that of A+D Museum and currently sits on the same site. The drawers speak to the idea of a museum as an instrument for storage, preservation, and compartmentalization of architectural artifacts in a space where they are also being exhibited, similar to the early cabinet of curiosities. The topology is composed of compartments that enables places for each of the incredibly diverse voices that compromise architecture today. The strap formally serves the purpose of consolidating the similar, though still rather disparate modules in unity while allowing them to be autonomous. They are essentially separate but together. The strap allows irregularities of the pile. It also references the pneumatic tendency of the A+D Museum and how it almost opportunistically packs its belongings and just promptly relocates or just completely ceases to exist. The strap introduces a typology for museums where generally the approach is to either be an embodiment of being a museum as a form or more or the more modern approach of becoming a box, sort of like a warehouse that tries its best to not control the meaning of its collection. It architecturalizes the tendency for museums as hoarding institutions and brings a typological answer to the program. It's a way for museums not to break apart and merge as one while also preserving their autonomy within the set instead of being subservient to the set. Lastly, this cabinet and this drawer stack also borrows from the history of soap boxes, where applied soap textures allude to the notion that architecture can sometimes stand on semi-raised platform, where ideas are not necessarily well-grounded, but should nevertheless be accessible to public dialogue. As storage, it becomes a cultural depot that actively plays a role in opening the access to architecture discipline, which for the most part caters primarily to an exclusive audience. That's my thesis. Yeah.
Great. Do you want to present some of this work, or is that the whole presentation?
These are just the formal exercises that I went through, putting this together. This I rendered inside the building. It's a section. These are pretty rough. Plans. This is an older section. An ISO. This is my miniature model, which I made out of soap. This is what I'm sampling off. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Do you mind maybe putting the image, the slideshow on the right onto like a section or one of the drawings or something?
Oh, a section.
Or a plan, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I, while you do that, ask the question that I raised in the previous project in the end? Partially due to Zoom, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to follow the description. So
intellectual, that has to be figured out, right? I mean, and you could spend.
What happened? Oh, do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So how would you, let's say, more general theoretical terms in terms of architectural discourse, how would you describe the topic of your research? What is it that you're exploring?
It's a formal exercise. I'm trying to introduce a typology in which the strap acts as a different way of stacking.
Okay.
Sorry.
So different, for example, compared to what?
To otherwise, for example, the strap allows, though it's not structurally, it allows for the form to be top heavy.
Okay. So you say, so let's say that in terms of, I'm not saying this is what you should have done, but in order for me to understand this, let's say the Lower Manhattan Athletic Club and Rem Koolhaas's analysis about stacking as this, like the elevator allowing for this fantastic cinematic experience of floors that are all radically different, one on top of the other. So that's one strategy of stacking, and that's one architectural discourse around stacking. So here you're proposing another method, then supposedly, if you take the Koolhaas example, produces another set of architectural effects and opportunities that differ from, for example, the Lower Manhattan Athletic Club discussion, right?
Sorry, couldn't follow it. Can you repeat?
Yeah, so if you take a high-rise building where each floor potentially could be different, and the elevator is the device that moves you between those floors. I mean, that's one, that is one strategy of stacking, and that's
Right.
The Lower Manhattan Athletic Club, as Rem Koolhaas discussed it, was a discussion of the radical, let's say, architectural effects and possibilities of that strategy. So you're saying that you have another strategy of stacking, and it supposedly here then produces another set of really, really exciting effects, right?
Yes.
And possibilities. So what would you, if you list some of those, what have you discovered? What does it allow you to do?
It creates spaces that are somewhat autonomous to the assemblage. It's not the same as extruding, basically an extrusion of the site. It allows for a different circulation, in which the going up doesn't necessarily mean going up. It might mean going outside, outdoors, entering another interior space, and then going up, which might not sound very efficient, but it's a different experience.
Okay. But to me, I think that was the best answer so far. I think that was really, I would have described it in those terms. I would have said that, the elevator in a conventional high-rise produces one set of experiences, when you move from space to space to space, and here you have a different organization where there's a different, dramaturgically different experience of space as you move from one within this constellation. And then you describe it in very concrete terms, but you could extract from that, let's say, more like architectural discourse level description of staging of differences and organization of space and the kind of experience that produces or creates, and how that differs from what more normative buildings do. And they not be on board. They're not going to have a discussion with you in terms of, I know what your aim is, and now I see what you're trying to do, and then we can play the game where I'm trying to help you or get excited about your discoveries. But I think it's important that that gets stated really clearly, and that's the kind of topic that I think you can carry. I mean, you can do a career on that topic. Most architectural buildings are organized around circulation, or some idea of circulation, and how that takes you through the building, and how that circulation takes you from one experience to another.
Thank you.
Yeah, it almost creates a kind of like, in some way, in the variety of spaces that it creates, because everything becomes right. I mean, like in this kind of stack, in the irregular stack, every module is dependent on what the module prior to that is doing. So it both borrows the idiosyncrasies of the pile so far, as you kind of keep adding pieces. The pile so far dictates what happens with the piece that continues, and that I think that's giving you so much like vertical variety, right, of spaces. That you have spaces where you are outside, but the overhead is really like close. It's very like you have very shallow, very short spaces, but that happen to be outside. You have exterior spaces that are completely exposed on all sides. You have almost like, A-frame conditions where that are not occupiable. It seems like through, if this your kind of stack is giving you anything, is actually that sort of incredible variety of spaces, both vertically, experientially, and in plan.
Yeah.
So there's something really unique to your formal gains from this exercise, as you you pointed out. But it's also a particular thing that the strap affords you, that kind of top heaviness that you mentioned. You said something that struck me, with it's a warehouse that does not control the meaning of its collection. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think for the most part, a lot of the modern museums, Tate Modern, for example, or a lot of the ones that are built by Herzog and Miron, they tend to be boxes instead of like the classical museum where they have like a very minimal form where it's almost like a warehouse. And I think the tendency is also because museums are, they show exhibits, but for the most part, I think they sort of act like it's a time capsule, and also like they tend to hoard a lot of art that sometimes they would only be able to display say 20% of their collection, whereas they're literally running out of spaces to store new collections. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
See, I'm kind of curious about that because I appreciate what you're saying, Erwin, about circulation, but I think another read on the project that I'd be curious to hear from you is like just the idea of like stability and instability to some extent. I mean, it seems that there's taking the stack. It's not a nice stack. It's not a perfect stack. It's like a very disorganized stack that looks like things could kind of fall apart. But then there's this big kind of belt around it that keeps it together. And I think that the sense that the museum has this tension between storage and not enough space, I'd be curious about like how that would play into needing an organization where, the thing has to have this instability because it's always maybe adding more stuff or kind of trying to find stuff that it didn't know where they put them. But I'm curious about like, if you could say something about the need for something which is certainly a kind of stack, but it's a very particular stack, and it requires something around it which is not very stack-like, which is something that pushes things back together. It's pretty peculiar for architecture, which tends to think of its physics as being kind of piling up off the ground in some way or another. And this one seems very much like it's already kind of a whole thing. It wouldn't fall apart. You could rotate it. You could put it here. You could put it there. I'd be curious about how those two ideas in your mind have something to do with one another. Like just how the form of it and its organization has something to do with this like extra stuff that you're interested in about the museum.
And when I was actually working on this, the finding floor plates, I actually the strength now that was being pointed out initially was actually such a huge headache for me, because all I want to do is put a stairs, put a cord, put an elevator, and just basically take the easy way of moving around the entire building. I also initially was trying to flatten the floor spaces which when I presented during the midterm, I said that the floor spaces should be flat, and I think it was Peter Tesla that told me they don't have to be flat. For example, Frank Bodet's Guggenheim is in the flat, doesn't not have a flat floor plate. But I think I'm trying to basically find a way in which the storage spaces, instead of strictly being storage space, it would also be the same as the exhibit space, in which you wouldn't have a separate hidden collection. Instead, all of your collection would be shown all at once. And I think one of the things that's really unique about Architecture and Design Museum is that it's nomadic and they move around quite often. And being on the move doesn't allow you to hoard. You always have to basically keep track of your belongings, because then you'd have to get rid of all the things that you've collected. I'm basically trying to prevent the building from having a space in which it will be meant for a permanent collection. Sorry, permanent storage. That's what I mean.
I think there's a couple of moments in which you, I think in some way, like maybe like, I really like the project, and I really like the combination of sort of like stacking and strapping as something that can start a project. And I think you would have, if I'm reading it or you correctly, I think you would have had a lot of fun continuing with that kind of investigation of realizing what are the particular conditions that the strap and the stack as a combination give you. And if you went into that like a lot more systematically, it gets a little bit iffier for me in terms of like the relationship of your kind of formal exercise to the programmatic and like content commentary that you're making. But if I stick to the sort of like strap and stack, I think there's so much in your project that you can just kind of go down on. So like there's a moment in which, like, you know, the third moment up in the stack, the actual box seems to respond to some of the physics of the strap pulling it, and it has sort of warped in shape, right? Like, would you consider that an exception to the rule, that it's like otherwise just boxes? Like, is the cinching an effect that you were going to investigate, or is that simply kind of like a little dash of like black pepper that you threw in there just to tie to some other idea that you wanted, right? Like if you were going to be like really rigorous about what the strap does, then one of your most dramatic moments is when the strap meets the upper right corner of your stack, where there's going to be a brutal amount of tension, right? Right where the box meets the strap, and that's going to be, you know, like trying to cut that strap like a razor, right? Because all of the tension is going to be concentrated there. So you have a huge number of kind of like physics happening that you could almost like inventory in terms of when you go vertical through tension, but you involve you involve autonomous elements. What happens, you know? And also the metaphor that you showed from the kind of scaling up from the soaps to the building, like certain things change. So certain things in your rule sets might change once there's a temporality to the stack at a small scale, right? You could undo that bow and wrap up the stack in a different way, and produces a new stack, therefore imbuing your project with a kind of temporality. Now, when you do that at the building scale, that might not be as available, that kind of temporality might not be as available to you logistically, in terms of, you know, we get into the realm of the logistical, but so then the strap becomes a metaphor for something else, right? Like maybe it might not be for a perpetual shift of new opportunities, of new stacks, but might be a symbol of concentrated physics and a symbol of sort of concentrated loads and pressures, for example, that different like modules have on each other. So you might lose the kind of freedoms of this stack at the small scale and the perpetual changes, but you might gain something else that might be a kind of, you know, particular conditions to call out that I think you were having fun with in a way, and I think maybe had you stuck to that, I wonder if we would be talking about this in a sort of like in a more animated way, because you had very good observations about that in terms of, yeah.
Laida, are you saying like almost like you would like these would look more like the soaps than they do now, that kind of thing, or like be more, not look, but necessarily like act like you had really rubbed away the material, not just kind of put a box inside of a strap? Is that sort of what you're kind of getting at?
I'm trying to get at the fact that I kind of wish that almost like the conceit of the project was to not necessarily become a programmed building, but become an analysis of like strap plus stack at the architectural scale. So like at like a very large scale. And if he had, you know, gone through that without the sort of woes of the contents, we might be talking about the particularities of like soft goods stacked at a small scale can be, if strapped like tight enough, they cinch or they break or they absorb the pressures of that kind of corner. The fact that, you know, when you strap something, the likeliest place for it to cinch is the 90-degree corner. If it's a soft good, it might break. If it's a hard box, it's the strap that might break, or it's the strap that will absorb the tension. I think like that kind of whole game of like doing a deep dive into stap and strap, you know, the other way, stack and strap.
It's really interesting discussing it in these terms, because that, I mean, what you're describing to me sounds like a discussion of really, really intricate relationships between systems and like intricate tweaking of structures and so on. And then, and it's really a little bit unclear where the project wants to be, because another reading, when I look at this, it sounds like contemporary commentary on the contemporary strategy, again, perhaps by Hallhouse or Seattle Public Library, or projects that take equate program to a box and they stack them, and then the residual space or the in-between space of the boxes becomes public space. So the misfit between the boxes, or the space between the envelope that shrink wraps the quote-unquote programmatic boxes, becomes that space which the public occupies, and then the program is there. It almost looks like a commentary on that strategy with a tongue-in-cheek, where you suddenly take these boxes, but unlike stacking them neatly, you throw them together, and you take the strap from Drogue design, from 90s furniture design project, and which is also Dutch, and then you wrap around. So I could also read this as a commentary on sort of contemporary Dutch architectural strategies. Or on the other hand, the stove and the discussion might lead you down a path where this becomes something that's actually intricately engineered and developed and starts to, let's say, gel together as something that becomes more coherent and cohesive than the stack, like the matchboxes that it first seems at a distance. Does that make sense? I don't know which way you would want to go. Which is it?
I think making it a building forces me to contend with the modules not being, even though they're boxes, they're not all the same, and so there's no way if I strap them together that they would fit perfectly into like a Tetris and form another box themselves, because the different shapes would kind of push and kind of displace one another, and making it a building, I think, allows me to find a way in which where I won't always have the easy way of putting circulation or putting floor plates or openings and making connections in between the thresholds, even if sometimes there are no thresholds and I have to kind of cheat a little bit, and I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, you wanted the problem of you wanted to give yourself the problem of your project. I think, I mean, what you're saying, I think, is like through the strap, your boxes became shims. So like literally through cinching, each box becomes a shim for the next one. So then it has to contend with the irregularity of the placement of the one before. So it's just kind of like a trickle up problem. And that was interesting to you because it's a new, that's maybe where you answer kind of the original question. It's a new way of stacking because it gives you all of the, it relieves you from all of the easy aspects of a continuous stack, which and then provides you with new consequences.
Yeah.
I almost read the project, maybe the intention of the project as not about so much about stacking, but about not creating intersections. So the way the strap works is it produces an aggregation of spaces and forms without having to Boolean and intersect. And I think that in and of itself is a problem to be worked on. And all of the comments that Laida was referring to about like the potential tectonics that arise from that and all the kind of interstitial spaces and gaps that you get because of that is super exciting. And I think maybe you kind of missed that in the translation from the SOAP model to the final project. Because when you scale it up to this level, then it just really becomes a metaphor of the strap, right? Like we don't really understand if the strap is structural in any way. To me, it acts at the level of iconicity again, you know, because that metaphor is so strong visually. But I think, you know, really, I think the project, the power in the project is the potential of like looking at not having to resort to digital intersections that you create, and the kind of ease that we use that tool, right? The ease of Boolean spaces. So having like a kind of double floor and a double wall meet against each other, those kinds of details that might arise from your project could be quite interesting.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, are there any final comments from anyone? If there aren't, what we'll do is, I think we're scheduled to take a short break. We are joined by a few more jurors, but we'll maybe introduce ourselves after the break for our next student for Hirao. So we're a little ahead of schedule, but I think it's okay. I think we can take maybe a 10-minute break. What time is it right now? It's 11:20, so 11:30. We can get back together and start with our final two students for today. And we'll begin by kind of just reintroducing everyone that's joined us over the last few minutes, if that works for everybody. Cool. So let's take a short break. I'll keep the Zoom room open, and we'll begin right at 11:30 in PST, Los Angeles time. All right. See you all soon. Hi, Hiral, are you ready?
Hi. Yeah, I'm ready.
Great. Let's wait for everybody to join us again, and we'll get started. Hi, Lydia. How are you? You're muted, but it's good to see you.
Sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I'm late.
It's okay.
Yeah. Nice to see you.
Why don't we
Lydia,
do?
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Lydia.
Hi, Kivi.
Hey, Lydia. I saw you're going to be in Tallinn soon.
I'm going to be. Oh, yes. That's right.
Yeah.
That's in 2 years, but yes.
You should drop by.
Yeah, we have no idea what the world will look like in 2022. So it's a long way in many fronts.
Yeah.
Why don't we do introduce everyone that's just joined us? So Lydia, we were asking everyone that, because of Zoom to introduce themselves, so everybody gets to see them rather than us introduce. So do you want to start and introduce yourself?
I don't have to say very much. I know a lot of you, and I've been at SCI-Arc. I'm an architect, engineer, scholar, and an assistant professor at the Cooper Union in New York. Right now, I'm actually in Greece, and it is 9:30 p.m. It's better reality for children here. So that was a big factor in our traveling, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us in your evening. We're also joined by Analia. Is that how did I say that correctly? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, good to be here. I'm an artist. I'm based in LA. I've been in touch with SCI-Arc for a while now. Florencia Pita brings the students to my studio very often. So it's quite a pleasure. And it's quite a pleasure to see all the connections between art and architecture. I think the SCI-Arc has that, constant dialogue. So I'm always happy to contribute in any way I can. And you'll always get some art references and art stories from me.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to meet you, Analia, and thank you for joining us today. We're also joined by Drake. Drake, I see you there. Hi.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Hi.
Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. My name is Drake Dillard. I am an architect with Perkins & Will. So I am happy to be here. I have done this before, so I'm happy to do it again.
Great. And where are you located?
I'm in LA. I live in Baldwin Hills.
Great.
And I did take the liberty to look on site, to look at the projects beforehand.
Great.
Thank you. I'm pretty much up to date. Yeah.
And we're also joined by one other SCI-Arc faculty member, Marika Trotter. Marika, do you want to say hi to everyone? Introduce yourself.
Hi guys, it's good to see you. I'm glad to be here. I think most of you know who I am. I run the History and Theory program here at SCI-Arc, and I haven't worked with this group of students. I work with some of the thesis students as their like theory support. So I'm actually really looking forward, Hiral, to see what you have to show, and congratulations. I'm very excited to be here.
Cool. So thanks everyone for our new jurors. And just a reminder, our other guests are Kivi and Laida. And we just saw 2 students from Margaret Griffin, and now we're going to see 2 more students. And our first student is Hiral, and she's advised by Jackie Bloom. So take it away, Hiral.
Okay. Is it set?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. Hi, this is Hiral, and Jackilin Bloom is my advisor for SCI-Arc GT 2020. My project title is Trespass, a Public Space. Borders exert an influence of sucking the life out of our cities and its neighborhoods. Not just literal walls and barriers, many features of urban life, from roads to parks to buildings, can cut off activities in public spaces and create what's called a border vacuum, as quoted by Jane Jacobs. In contrast to this view by Jane, Kevin Lynch argues that boundaries can fuse communities together. An edge may be more than simply a dominant barrier if some visual or motion penetration is allowed through it, if it is structured to some depth with the regions on either side. It then becomes a seam rather than a barrier, a line of exchange along which two areas are sewn together. From here, it reminds me of an artist, Kader Attia, who's a French artist who exhibits in 2018 in an exhibit called We Don't Imprison Ideas, where he talks about roots and can also grow in concrete. In my opinion, it does hint upon stitch or sew, which is explained in an exchange by Lynch. My thesis is an exploration of the latter quote by Kevin Lynch. It is a thesis about boundaries, walls, edges, and fences, and how these things can transgress their negative connotations to become what I am proposing as a public space called trespass. Despite privacy and security, a solid compound wall, on the other hand, fails to promote any sense of openness and approach, either physical, visual, notional, or both. Even though perforated, they can be understood as edges, dividers, and enclosures. However, it is a loosely fitted object demarcating the periphery when closely looked at. Though light, hence in its behavior of confining an entity is very heavy. For example, a perforated prison enclosure as you see in the image. The use of lightweight, ready-made chain link fence used for security, as suggested by Frank Gehry, can be used as an object to associate these negative connotations to convert them into something which is much more positive. Does a fence, can a fence proactively unite? In current scenarios where we come across this pandemic, it is interesting to see how people consider converting their backyard fences into a place of social congregation. This is something that has interestingly inspired me. This is coming back from my reference of my personal town, personal city where I come from, Mumbai, where I'm intrigued by how inclusiveness of a public space can be very informal, inviting, and non-segregatory, as you see in these images. To take ahead, what a fence essentially does is it uprights a boundary. It defines moments of entry and exit. But in order to understand or study the boundaries in detail, in a more positive light, I started to experiment with aggregation and composition of these fences through collages. Further ahead from here, I started to index out these fence types to examine the symbolic nature of these as elements. I wanted to look more closely at the negatives and the positives created by these opportunities of these attributes of elements as diagramming. In order to explore its layered application, these diagrams were carved into rubber stamps. Through the exercise of stamping, I could transgress these symbolic limitations, as you saw in the diagrams above, into a physical model and an analog to digital transgression of these stamping through repetition and collaging. This investigation uses color and analog stamps to create the kind of material quality for the project. You can see some of the examples of how unfolded elevation starts to emerge out of these stamp techniques, as you see in the animation now. Talking about the context, I was looking for an opportunity to use to create a public space in Los Angeles. This is an area in Chinatown, Los Angeles. I came across this site and community center, which is marked in the red as you see it. It is diagonally opposite the Los Angeles State Historic Park. This is a convergence of railway tracks, two main access to the freeway, North Spring Street, North Main Street, and LA River. This is how you can access the plot, which is there is an indirect pedestrian access and a vehicular access to the plot. The tiny plot marked in yellow is the Downey Recreation Center. The Downey Recreation Center, that is my proposed plot within the site. And the areas marked in blue are the industrial zones, and the areas marked in orange are the residential zones. The existing community center is tucked, as you can see, is tucked against the bridge with large sports courts in front of it. It is hardly visible and easily missed. My project takes an existing community center on a precarious site and proposes to convert it into a visible public space. In my project, new edges, rails, walls, and fences straddle the existing building at varying widths and thicknesses. These new walls also fold to the ground to form platforms for performances, seating, and landscape. This is an image of showing how you can access the site. There's an indirect access which takes you to the ramp, and otherwise there's only a vehicular access to the site. This is how you would see it in plan. So if you pan from left to right, this is how you enter the site through this ramp. Trespass is essentially a pavilion, a series of walls, platforms, benches, and landscape that wrap around the existing community center building. It is an open program, meaning it is meant to be used how people interpret it to be used. I imagine it as a performance space, a play space, somewhere where you could just eat your lunch, maybe hang out with family. In current scenario, maybe just click pictures for a virtual background of your Zoom. My intention is to stop seeing fences as a separation, but as a medium, a buffer zone, and the space in between. I would like to propose accessible, publicly utilized, partially equitable places, which can have any informal activity it wants to conduct. Thank you.
Hiral, while everyone gets settled, I'll share my screen with your Miro board, and if anybody wants me to zoom in on anything, I can just do that.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, I can commend, because I was being difficult with some of the previous presentations in terms of the, let's say, clarity of the thesis. I think your presentation is beautifully clear in terms of what's at stake, what you're trying to work with. It's extremely easy to follow. And it's, I think it's an absolutely beautiful, joyful project. And it's very easy I think, for everybody to now engage in discussing its potential because of the clarity of and the logic of the presentation, how you set it up.
Mm-hmm.
Can you pronounce your name again for me? Sorry.
Trespass.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, you mean the project name?
No, your name.
My name is Hiral.
Hirat, okay. So this, again, I'm Drake Hirat. First question I have for you is, how do you feel about presenting your project over the internet like this versus presenting it in person? Are you very comfortable with that?
I think if I would have the opportunity to present it in person, I would have a more performative, like it would be as bright as my model in the sense of the way I would present. I think I would be much more comfortable in the physical presentation of it.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, very good, very good. Well, you presented very well. You know, I done some traveling, and one area that this reminds me of, I was in South Africa, and there was this village where the women of the village actually painted on all the walls in very bright colors. And so I was curious, some of this is so fantastic, but how do you see it representing culture per se?
I think the idea here for using these colors or the formal language of it was to promote a sense of inviting space, because right now the Downey Recreation Center sits in a spot where it is not easily viewed. for my project, the intention to color it or to make it so visible was to actually invite people, to draw people in. Because right now it sits in a position where you can't nearly even see. Like if you drive down, you can't see the center. So for me, the idea was to visually first attract crowd in.
Yeah, when I saw the midterm, I was very curious to see how far you have gone with it. I find it very interesting, very just exciting. So, but again, my question was more around, I'm a people person. I look at things a lot of times in terms of how it relates to the community and how it relates to the culture and the people. So although you made an example in terms of your culture per se and growing up, that's why I asked that question in terms of expanding upon that. But thank you.
Yeah, Hiral, I think just to follow on Drake's comments, I think it would be important for you as you kind of package your work here for the broader audience of the discipline and the community, variously construed, that you talk a bit more specifically about the palette that you chose, why you chose those specific colors, if they have resonances with the context, how you're defining context, what communities in particular, maybe just be a bit more specific. The other thing that I would say too is that you need to think very carefully going forward about whether the application of a particular palette and particular shapes to a border condition, of course, it draws attention to it. And as you said, it draws you in. You've done a really fantastic job here with the kind of liveliness of the project. It's great. But whether that actually addresses the thesis that you set out to tackle at the beginning of your project. You said, you started out with these really great quotes, very provocative quotes coming from two, very prominent voices in a particular period of architectural history, having to do with borders and having to do with the condition of boundaries. Of course, we know that all architecture engages boundaries and is in fact possible to construe as the construction of particular boundaries for specific exteriors and specific interiors. So it's a very deep thing that you're setting out to address. And I suppose in the end of the day, you have to ask yourself if kind of doing stamping techniques and cutout techniques and collaging techniques around an existing border, around an existing boundary, is as far as you think you can go. Because it's not really that far. You're not actually kind of breaking in to the interior here or pulling back out to the civic space, or anything like that. You've kept your work kind of almost like a decoration around the existing site and the existing project. So as you begin to develop your own career, and as you go from here onto the next thing and the thing after that and the thing after that and the thing after that, which I'm very much looking forward to seeing where you go with this, I would challenge you to take it a bit farther.
Mm-hmm. I also want to say how I think there is, of course, room for improvement, and I can agree with that, but the project, the timing of the project, this very emotional time for everyone to come up with something so playful, almost like post-apocalyptic, like after everything we're going through, to think that maybe there could be like an after, where this surplus of fences could become a playground or some type of public space. I mean, pretty much like what happened in Berlin after the wall came down. Or the reference you showed of this COVID fence situation. I just can see the spirit, and I think it's just something really important. I mean, I hope you keep it up. I mean, I hope you keep that spirit going, because we need so much of that. And I think the timing and the sensitivity to the times and the sensitivity to finding this kind of post-apocalyptic that you know, it might be messy. Like usually I wouldn't be into this aesthetic, to be honest, but because the times are so like difficult, I mean, like this type of like chaos or like post chaos that then can be like, you know, a space for playing in a way. I think it's very sensitive. I mean, I think there is something that you are connecting to in terms of the collective unconscious. And, you know, I think it's a really, really cool project.
Hiral, hi. I think it's a wonderful project, very beautifully rendered and very sensitive, and in terms of the way that it's constructed and its tectonic sensibilities. I think one thing that removes some strength, some power from what it could be is the fact that you haven't talked about what is the public that you're instrumentalizing to trespass. Who are these subjects that are trespassing, and how you are specifically enabling their movement. So you're constructing a very playful, porous boundary that is half 2D, right? The wall becomes a floor. It's almost like a beautiful mosaic, super graphic. And I really think that the playfulness of that project is extraordinarily interesting. But walls and borders are such dire and raw symbols of territorialization. If you think of the national border, the Berlin Wall, the fencing that separates different kinds of populations and segregates the insiders from the outsiders, I think the power of such a project would be what kind of cross-territorial movements it enables. Do you know the project by Ronald Rael and Virginia Sanfratello? And do you know this one with a swing? It's a very famous border at the between the U.S. and Mexico with I think it's called a seesaw, where children are playing, and some children were you know, from the Mexican borders, and others were from the U.S. border. And the porosity of that impenetrable element was becoming, because it was playful, it was becoming even more powerful. So I think that you have a lot of very interesting sensitive tectonic sensibilities and the use of color, but we don't know where and how it is applied to whom and who it enables to trespass and for what reason. So I think that the choice of site possibly could become even more powerful if you are to implement it in a place where movement is prohibited, or maybe the territory is mushy and doesn't enable. So I think that one thing that I'm missing from this project is the context and how it instrumentalizes movement. I think the handling of the barrier tectonically is amazing. And, you know, a lot of, I've been living in New York for years. And one of the places that, that I frequently went to since a very long time ago is a storefront for art and architecture. And the facade of that building, which was done by Stephen Hall and Vito Acconci in the 1980s, was full of windows that would pop in different dimensions. So it was one of the first instances where a wall was hinged in so many different dimensions that it reminds me of your kind of operations. But that was, the porosity of that barrier was enabling a kind of public to occupy the barrier in different ways. If you go to a national border, then it becomes a much more, you know, it's much more severe and dire political situation. And you have shown me instances of your own background. I don't know where you are, where that was from. I think it would be nice to know. But I would really like to hear where and how you're imagining this, this territorial device to enable the porosity of, and movement of people and communities and different kinds of subjects.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing that I've been surprised to see emerge in our time here all, and I think your project is dealing with it, is the old Venturi idea from complexity and contradiction of linings, and the idea that you could adumbrate a container condition on the inside, or in your case on the outside, to kind of thicken and complicate a space that might otherwise simply be a space that you walked by instead of engaged with. I've actually seen that in a couple different thesis projects this semester in particular at SCI-Arc. And I wonder, you know, it's funny, you guys, some of us have been around long enough to remember the kind of joyful and hopeful projects of earlier moments of social and political upheaval, probably actually less significant than the one that we're living through now, as far as I can tell being in it, particularly of the late 60s and the 70s. And of course, you chose quotes from that era to start us out. I think it is incumbent on us to determine how we can pick up the pieces of those projects from that era. I put up in the chat, I mentioned the best stores, which your work also reminds me of a bit. Again, from that time period, it's incumbent on us to figure out what we can pick up from that time and what we should throw away and what we need to build upon and what we need to let go because it didn't work. I think it is totally appropriate that somehow the idea of simply attenuating or expanding or reinforcing or extending the little bit that we have, however dire the situation might be, has come back to the fore. But I also want us to be aware that now more than ever is the time for radical reimaginings of what we think the present and the future could be. So in your work as you go forward, and I'm just saying this kind of also just generally to us, you know, the jurors, but also to the students and whoever, but also to you specifically, Hiral, my aim for you and my prompt for you and my hope for you would be that you take this nugget and your clearly joyful creativity and blow it up. Think big, think deep, be truly ambitious about the scope of your work. If your work is going to be about lining things and it's going to be about adding things and making layers and making stamps and building things up, producing these kinds of riotous and truly lovely patterns, then let's figure out how to do that on an urban scale, or let's figure out how to do that all over the world at once.
Yeah, I would say I'm somebody who's first and foremost interested in experience, and it's terrific to see someone who is able to state an intent to produce a particular experience or social space, if you will, and then come up with a set of creative architectural devices towards actually producing that experience. And then everybody's discussing how you can have better and more sophisticated focus over those tools. But I think you already have quite a good command, or at least intuition, in terms of use of pattern that expands the threshold over the building, the associations of the playful patterns and the colors, the use of temperature and the color in order to create different sensations of depth. And the one kind of subjective interpretation I would interject here, perhaps is when I look at this, I think of Sanford, who I think is in another review I saw him. Sanford wrote an essay about African quilt, where he talks about the African music and how a group of people play together, and in a manner where one musician will follow another and another musician follow a third. And you'll have a group of people playing multiple overlaying rhythms at the same time. And there's something to be said about like complex layered rhythms and their associations to social space and how they organize space. And so perhaps there is something to the actual pattern and the way that it constructs space that you could argue starts creating opportunity for a different kind of social space that's perhaps more inclusive and more heterogeneous and so on. But that's me projecting something onto your patterns, but that's what I would personally look at. But I think it's a really great project, and I think architecture is a little bit like music. You will never turn it into a social science where you can prove that these devices that you use will create a certain effect. Nor do you ever have to do so. You just have to have confidence that you have to be clear in terms of what you're trying to create. And you have to intuit and use all the expertise of all of your disciplinary expertise in the creation of those effects. And then you try to evaluate, when you actually do get a chance to build it, you evaluate what works, what doesn't work. And that's how you sharpen your sword.
You know, I like the comment that you just made. We are, without giving too much information, we're in the process of designing a museum for Motown Records, and in part of the fenestration on the facade of one of the buildings, we took the sound waves of an album by Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, and transposed that onto the building. I say that only to make a point that these things do not happen by accident. There must be some intention in terms of what you're trying to get. So if there is an intention of trying to create something, and for me it's always back to a culture, to people, to the community, then one must understand that. So they're making deliberate attempts to address that, and not just arbitrarily doing something that just happened to be beautiful or it happened to be something that people like, but it's making a statement that means something. I think that's important for me.
Yeah, I think Drake, actually, it's sort of like building up on that. It seems like Hiral, you've given yourself a sort of in some way like a perfect contradiction where you're telling us like border and community center, things that are sort of like so charged with politic and a projected constituency, and yet in some way what you're presenting us, it's like the equivalent, like it's as if you gave yourself like no sight, like a kind of like a post-retail condition where this might be a warehouse that went out of business, and so you had like no aesthetic charge to the space from which to work out a kind of a constituency. So you have like border and projected constituency on one end, and then the kind of the spatial condition of the space that you're showing, or the ghost space of what you're showing, the kind of what's left to fill. It's like it's so post-industrial, sort of like post-warehouse, like e-commerce. Like I feel like I'm standing outside of a mall that went out of business, right? Like in some way. And if we start your project from that point of view, you had a parking lot to work up from. You actually gave it an enormous amount of character, and you addressed the plan, the section, both in height and in complexity, you know, in many ways, like both color and in different kinds of chunks and fences and cutouts. And so I put the team project, the like ghost box, on the chat for you to look at, because that is a project that deals exactly with that, this kind of post-retail condition. So I'm kind of interested in like maybe to hear from you a little bit, if you see the contradiction in terms of like what I'm seeing, which is, it's for you a really productive one and a really good one. I'm wondering if you see what I see.
Yeah, so the answer to that question is, when I was looking through site, this site was actually a good potential for me, because this sits on an industrial area and the building is pretty much not used despite being a recreation center. and it sits around the low-cost residential zone and industrial zone, which is half dead. So I think adding a structure like this would probably not only economically boost the entire area, but would also be a good green space or a good public space to invite people in. So I do see that contradiction, and it was a purposeful, like it was intentional to choose a site like this. I did have options to consider going to a larger scale or to actually put this project or deploy it into a real border condition. But I think it wouldn't have offered me the contradiction that I'm trying to talk about as much as probably the potential of the scale of this project would have offered me on this.
Yeah, that's visible to me, that the fact that you had to, it's almost like you had to
the fact that it sits
you
right,
had to paint sorry, go ahead.
Also the fact that it sits right opposite the LA Historic State Park, it also adds to that gesture of having community center, which is much more inviting and not pretty dead.
I just want to say I love the reference to quilting. I think it's brilliant, and I would encourage you to read everything about quilts because they really are so much about this, women during war times, trying to wait for their husbands to come home and making these quilts and hiding letters inside the quilt. And I mean, there are just unlimited stories of the meaning of quilting and where they come from. I will post 2 links for a really amazing show I saw at the V&A Museum in London and another project. But I mean, I think it's such a brilliant, thing, because you really want to, enrich the project as much as possible. And I think it was just a very cool connection.
Are there any final comments from anybody? Hiral, I think this was a beautiful presentation today. I've seen the project a few times over the summer with Jackie, and it was really wonderful to watch. So congratulations on finishing Thesis. I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm jumping in. If we were in SCI-Arc in the building, I'd be walking around the corridors, but instead I do a link tree of Zooms. So it's so nice to see so many friends. Kivi, I haven't seen you so much. So we were chatting.
Yeah, there you go,
Nice to see you. And then Analia, also always nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. And Laida, how you doing? You're in the outdoors. You have clean air there, I think. You're not in California.
A bee just came into my indoor-outdoor condition.
Envy.
To make it more real.
All envy,
So I was dealing with that.
LA is insane. The air is so, I mean, it's like unrecognizable. But you can see it in the newspaper. Hi, Lydia. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Florencia.
And Drake, nice to meet you. And thanks for joining us.
Sure, follow me.
I love that story that you can make a public space out of a song. I think that's a future studio topic. A thesis, that should be a thesis. Sorry that, Hiral, I didn't see your project, but that was a great comment. And Amit, nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here again.
Bye, David.
Thanks for coming, Florencia.
Join another party over there.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye, Flora.
Bye, Florencia. Nice to see you.
Bye.
So we're going to see our last student. Richard, are you there? You ready?
Hello, everyone.
Great. So we have Richard, who is my student, Richard Mapes. And I think you might want to all make Richard's view big on your screen because he will be doing a lot with his camera, I believe. All right, Richard, take it away.
All right, I'm posting a link to a website in the chat right now that you can all browse throughout the course of this conversation for the next 40 minutes. But with no further ado, I'll just jump into the presentation.
We tend to think about the perfect boyfriend as a figure contained in a body, a picturesque silhouette, chiseled features, and a smile that glimmers in Instagram feeds, posters, and so on. But we tend to overlook certain features of these images that frame these perfect bodies. While we gaze at a portrait, we might notice a constructed scene behind the figure. Light, shadow, textures, furniture, clothing, and an environment of some kind. In certain portraits, constructing the background is an act that is inseparable from the depiction of the portrait's figure. In Untitled number 175, Cindy Sherman diminishes her figure. Her face is apparent only in the mirrored coating of a pair of sunglasses. In the foreground, she places candy bar wrappers, half-eaten pastries, and a towel soiled with vomit, all located within a blue-hued, sandy beach scene. It is, perhaps, an image of self-inflicted pain in the pursuit of attaining a beach body ideal. By contrast, Hyacinth Rigaud positions Louis XIV within a royal primitive hut. Louis's body is enshrouded in billowing, luxurious fabrics that part like the Red Sea at the command of his gold staff, revealing a pair of perfect pins propped up on platform pumps. Louis's portrait positions the background as an accessory to the primary figure. Cindy Sherman's portrait sets itself apart from others in suggesting that the scene's ephemera is, in some way, the figure of the painting itself. The perfect boyfriend builder constructs a portraiture of the spatial surround, a cheeky mise-en-scène built by desire. Shuffling through sets of references, it attempts to visualize the perfect boyfriend by building the locations in which he might be found. A bustling city street at dusk, a cozy but kitschy suburban attic, a moody movie set in a remote location, the bridge of a cargo ship in a tempestuous squall, or a clandestine and lascivious sculpture gallery. Simultaneously, each scene is uniquely framed and developed with media and aesthetic categories that are related to the references at hand. A nostalgic scene may use painterly techniques in Photoshop and a 5:3 aspect ratio, while a playful scene might employ game engine shaders on a 16:9 HD screen. As a result, unique portraits are composed of apparent elements, but they nonetheless reveal certain narratives related to the creation of an ideal subject. When I was young, I started teaching myself how to draw in perspective. I was given a set of drafting tools that my mom had when she was in design school, and they came in a suede tote bag, but it came with a perspective book. I skipped to the good stuff at the end of the book to learn how to set up a horizon line and vanishing points and all that, but I skipped over how to start with a plan and elevation and how to determine a field of view to set up the drawing. I would start by drawing one of two objects. On the one hand, it would be something that was at the scale of furniture or at a human scale. So if I set out drawing, say, a chair, I would draw the chair first and based on the chair's qualities that would determine the vanishing points. And then I would continue constructing a chair from there. I would add other objects. I would layer them, scale different things, and create a composition in which the architectural surround was kind of a last concern. And it resulted in these kind of bland architectural spaces, but interesting still lifes that referenced Architectural Digest magazines, the loft in that sitcom show that my parents were watching, or photo journals from around the world. But if I started drawing an object at the scale of a building, I would start with the rationale that would produce interesting forms. I would draw the construction lines really lightly with 2H lead and fill in the B-spline that would ultimately become a wild spiral staircase with a brutalist style finished and rendered in board-formed concrete, set in the middle of kind of like a fantastic architectural setting that had no objects in it. It was just a building. I would reference the construction of the Denver Art Museum, for example, that I was watching happening live when I was young. Or I would reference the postcards that my dad would send me from New York when he went on business trips, fascinated with these buildings that were objects in their own right. And all these drawings carried somewhat of an improvisational tone in their construction, but they were constantly in pursuit of two distinct priorities. On the one hand, some drawings prioritized aesthetics, but on the other hand, the drawings that were more interested in exploring form were interested in investigating the rationale of organization. And in retrospect, I could divide my first portfolio that I ever made with these graphite drawings into two categories. One that was kind of interested in the recombination of cultural references for the sake of creating some kind of domestic scene, and another that was interested in pushing the boundaries of organizational rationale. And I wonder if there's kind of a queer idea in working in those two separate ways, being the same person, but kind of engaging in different aesthetic languages at the same time as I was teaching myself how to draw, which again, I don't think would have been possible if I hadn't taught myself how to draw the wrong way.
All right, welcome back, everybody.
I think everyone can switch back to the gallery view if you want.
Richard, thanks for that night out in town. I feel like I went out. I actually, there was like a stop, but it's sort of like a cheesy hotel. The music was like, I just feel like we made a few stops throughout the night. It's like definitely 3 a.m. So thanks for that actual experience.
Hey, Richard, Drake.
I'll call the cab. I'll call the cab. Sorry, go ahead.
Before I make any comments, I'd like to hear from you. What's your intention here? I wanted to just hear from you.
I think the intention is a perhaps second take or alternate take on the idea of curating sets of references that we use in design, but also holding those like ideas of multiple sets of references all in view while we're also simultaneously reading architecture. So the idea that architecture can be a constructive act, but also simultaneously an act that is read, and that it's read by different eyes who all may have a different take on any given object that we produce. So in the end, I think the ultimate question has to do with, again, the construction of an ideal subject, and questioning what does it mean to construct both an object but also a subject as we're working through design.
Okay, thank you. Well, I tell you, for me, you caught me at a disadvantage because I love the music you had. It was absolutely fantastic. Your taste for music is similar to mine. So that right there kind of just took me over the edge there. But I thought, I saw the presentation before. I'm glad I did. There's a lot of moving parts. A lot of moving parts. I think if I had seen it for the first time, it's just so much. It is hard for the brain to keep up with it to some degree. And I know that might be deliberate, so that's good. But you know, we have a situation, you know, where I live. I'm on a hillside, and when the 4th of July comes, there's all these fireworks, and you see like 1,000 fireworks, and you're looking all over the place at all these fireworks, and it's beautiful, but at the same time it becomes confusing. You like the fireworks, but again, you can't see them all because they're all happening at the same time. And I felt myself feeling the same way with the presentation, with so many things going on. I wasn't quite sure what to focus on, what to pay attention to. There's some jazz musicians, you might know some, but Miles Davis and El Giro. And El Giro used to sing in a certain style that he would just make up sounds, and he'd scat. They call it scatting. He'd be all over the place. And he at that particular time in his career, he was not understood. And then when he slowed down, and he kind of came to a level where the average human being could understand him, he became commercially very successful. And I don't know if you're following all that, but that was kind of the feeling I had.
Yeah, I think there was kind of a conscious decision to tend toward the overwhelming kind of nature of
right.
work. But I understand.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but I also love it so much, and I agree. I think we're too old for him in a way. You know, it's like it's just, you know, this brilliant representation of this like postmodern culture. And I mean, I'm not sure where you're going in terms of architecture, but I would love to see this in a museum context. And I'm like, I want to send it to all the curators I know, because it's a show that I say a show because I already kind of can see it in an art museum or an art gallery where like you're really like immersed by it. I want to see it like in a dark room, in a big screen. And I want to see it like, I really want to like finish the call and watch it like another 20 times to like appreciate all the details.
Yeah.
I really think it's brilliant, and how in tune you are with, as I said, like this type of like like video game, like virtual 3D. I mean, like there were just so many details. And, you know, when I saw this, like I was really like enjoying it. And then like you had this ballerina and this like lace thing draping over, and I was like, okay, like this is like overwhelmingly incredible, you know. So I really have no idea how to talk about it in terms of architecture, but I think in terms of art, the idea of like space and how we're feeling in terms of like this virtual type of realm that we're all, you know, being part of, I think it's really, really in tune with the times, and in terms of technique, really amazingly done. I mean, it's, I really, as I say, I want to watch it many more times, and I want to share it with the art community. It's very impressive video.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Richard, like in some way, it is. It's like it's a project that's very sort of telling of the times. Like whatever, like if something about acknowledging complexity and like you know, change something in architecture or just became like a kind of variant. I think maybe like this moment in time is like more about like holding multiples. It's a different sort of definition of complexity, where it's like, I mean, some people have made a kind of more generational notation about it, like maybe younger generations now, in having dealt with sort of excess and the amount of like media and like ability to sort of, you know, represent ourselves in a multitude of ways. Like we've developed an ability to be multiple, so not just like complex, but to hold many things at the same time. And I feel like your project in some way like points towards that. So it's like it's a new definition of complexity that might be multidimensional. It goes beyond identity onto sort of like references, mediatic approaches, identity is somewhere there in the mix. But it just what it does, it's like it holds complexity on equal, and it sort of juggles it. So I don't know. I kind of want to like maybe I want to throw that to the room to help us all kind of like, you know, do like some seedling of a theorizing of like what could be like a 4D complexity, right? Like what's 4D complexity? What's like if we're in a moment where you know, like nothing is binary, what other dimensions to complexity can we attach? Are they moving image, or is it yeah, like in how many more ways can complexity be complex, and hold like all the multiple references that you were saying, Richard?
I would say I agree with the comments that I've seen one. I mean, your work could go straight into an art gallery and would be better than many things you see in there. But if we want to discuss the potential of the work for architecture, perhaps in a slightly more conventional sense, then it reminded me, the discussion reminds me of what Sylvia Levin wrote when she discussed Kalipolitti's work, and said that, if I remember correctly, she said that, or discussed the idea of bringing into the same frame things that are not usually there. And somehow, I mean, I was wondering what I would take away from your work, and that's what I find myself thinking, whether there's a possibility of bringing into the frame of architecture things that have previously not been there. And that's, of course, would be fantastic, because architecture, let's say, as a discipline or as a media, is losing a little bit of power, and it's not really addressing the audience that it perhaps used to address. So I don't know. That's how I understand your comment about complexity. That somehow some of that complexity that you have in your presentation could find its way into an architectural frame, or to the frame that usually contains only architecture.
I was really curious too, just following on that, Richard, and I thought that was a really provocative and very thoughtful, and even profound discussion that you had about how you learned how to draw. And you made the comment that it was a queer way to draw, or perhaps it could be interpreted as a queer way to draw. And I see your multimedia artwork, to me, it's more in the realm of art at the moment than architecture, perhaps, following from that. very beautifully. It makes me wonder, knowing what you know about how, like, you've gone back and you've excavated how you learn to draw and thought about what made that queer. Can you then begin to think with us, and I don't mean to put you too much on the spot, but can you begin to think with us about how that might translate into something built in the physical world? Just to be very conservative for a second about how we think about architecture for the sake of pushing the discussion forward, because that is a super big question. You know, how do we develop new techniques that represent queerness in this field, which has been so dominated by hetero-cis conceptions of space and by hetero-cis conceptions of how we represent the space that we understand?
That's an excellent question, and kind of cuts right to the core of a lot of things that David and I have been discussing, thinking about this summer. And I think I might kind of propose back to you that the products that architects make are not only buildings. We also make drawings, we make softwares, we make so many other things that result in the end product, which happens to be a building. But there's been a lot of discussion on the role of the tools that we use, the frames that we see through, the things that we invent in order to get to a sort of end product. The building that maybe if we were to reorient the way in which we work or use those tools, or to constantly kind of keep the idea of working in a certain way in focus, that might, in the end, maybe not necessarily make a queer building, which frankly, I don't think is possible. I think that's probably a pretty big statement to make as well. But we might be able to kind of understand that architecture is perhaps more than what it results in.
Right, but I want you to keep thinking about that. I'm saying this to David now too. You guys have to keep thinking about this, because that's not a new concept in architecture. We've registered that since the Renaissance, since we developed the modern discipline that we have. And so if there are going to be sort of fresh developments for the discipline, you know, something that I'm fully willing to admit might be more of my concern than yours, then we're going to have to find ways to be more specific about how, you know, it can't just be how representation and other forms of media and other forms of mediation and the ways that we see and forms of opticality and all that stuff, how those things have expanded. It's got to be then what do we do with what we know now? You know what I mean?
I wonder, Richard, if you consider your work as like a form of like visual activism in a way, which is kind of what this is kind of the way I've been reading your work, in that at the center, it seems to really address the visual structure and how you're producing the scenes. And at the two ends are like subjecthood and objecthood, and maybe even some self-reflexivity that's happening. But at the center, really, it seems like the techniques that you're using to produce the imagery addresses things like stereotypes, which might be in the form of known objects and known figures and known interpretations. And so, I don't know, I see in total that this is a kind of activism through a new kind of visual literacy being projected out there somehow. I don't know what you think of that, but.
I think you understand by now that your project leaves us a little bit numb, both in its beauty, but at the same time, it leaves us with a lot of question. And one of the questions that I think is in everybody's mind is, what is the agency, your agency in that world? Like, I mean, let me say that differently, because I don't think that I'm trying to, that I'm saying what I'm trying to say very clearly. If we think of, I've seen a lot of projects during the pandemic that are becoming more and more esoteric and kind of in containment. There's a retrieval from the commons and a kind of, let's say, projection of certain types of subjectivity. And I think that your world is absolutely amazing and wonderful. I agree with you in every way that as architects, we don't only build buildings, but we construct worlds. Either these worlds are softwares or virtual environments or forms of land or other kinds of objects that are at the periphery of the disciplinary boundaries. But in most of these cases, these worlds are inhabited by others. And my question is, in some moments, the project becomes almost like a projection of a subjectivity, whereas it does touch on important legacies. For example, the act of collection, how you construct an archive of memories, an archive of images. There's an important legacy of that, both in the history of art as well as in the history of architecture. Somebody mentioned Sylvia Lavin. She was writing about the archive, how buildings become archives of impressions. I remember reading an article in Log, because they're so fragmented by our digital media and photographs and Instagram and different kinds of platforms, that buildings are nothing more but a collection of these impressions of thousands of users. So they're crowdsourced in a way. So buildings themselves become archives as well. So there are important questions that you can tap into, and your project is not esoteric, presenting your own kind of reality. It does touch on important social and cultural questions about how we construct worlds around us and how we collect objects, how we create archives. My question is that you're presenting it as a personal narrative rather than as a world that can be inhabited by others. And I think that it would strengthen your case tremendously. It's a beautiful narrative in its own, but it would strengthen it tremendously if you were to present it through these kinds of shared legacies with others, because otherwise we retrieve in our subjectivities, everybody in our laptops, and we share our dreams, and we're more and more isolated. So I was wondering what you think on that. It's not a critique, so I don't mean to like put you on the spot and tell you, you know, you're such a, it's not. It's just I'm truly wondering, you know, what if we keep communicating through this medium, you know, disconnected from the bodies that we that occupy the world and touch each other, what will become of our shared experiences and legacies, both in terms of, you know, within the discipline of architecture and in terms of how we construct worlds that we share and inhabit. And I know that, of course, you alone cannot answer that question because, you know, you're graduating and you have done an incredibly powerful, beautiful project. But you are bringing a powerful personal narrative, and it's very hard to evaluate a narrative. So I wonder if, you know, do you see it as personal, or do you see it as a kind of world that we can share?
I think that's a great question. I think it's throughout the course of putting together the presentation, I tried employing techniques that would rather position me kind of as a character. in that narrative, as opposed to just kind of like opening up and showing you my world. I was more interested in building a film in which one might be able to relate to the character in the film. And you know, going back to your comment about shared experience, I think I think you're right. I don't know if there really is a way in our current setting, if we were to remain in Zoom, to have the same kind of shared experiences that we've come accustomed to, or that we hold dear. So then the question is, the medium, the screen, the mediator, does that become a broadcasting device in which we become characters ourselves, and then project that character through the medium, perhaps in the same way that we do in social media, though I think it's intensified now, very, very much intensified. And then do we kind of like characterize ourselves or create portraits of ourselves and then push those through the screen in order to be seen in ways that we haven't been seen before? And I think that's fairly novel, and with the visual component and the live component, again, separates itself from a lot of social media conversations that have been happening on the same subject, the idea of being seen or broadcasting oneself.
I have a architect's proposition, or just not a critique, but just something, because I keep wondering, like everybody, what does this have to do with architecture? But if I think of Matthew Barney, who creates narratives about the artworks that are false, that become parts of the story of the actual. When you see his sculpture, there's a story in the movie, a false narrative about the formation of that sculpture in a movie. And then there are pictures of that sculpture or pictures of the movie in the exhibition. There are layers and layers of narratives that have to do with the actual physical objects that occupy the space which you occupy, which are then, you know, layered with performance, etc. And I think what you're presenting isn't that. I can imagine, if I had to spatialize or architecturalize your work, Matthew Barney comes to mind, John Soane's museum comes to mind, Luis Barragan's neurotic house with horses and mirrored balls to show you around the corner, and glamorous women that he loved come to mind. So I can imagine a kind of coalescence of architecture and digital media and interior objects, all coalescing in actually like three-dimensionalizing what you just showed us. And it poses an interesting question, because I always personally wonder, I believe that when somebody is able to project a very, very unique or communicate a unique, perhaps personal narrative, that's immediately interesting to everybody. And architecture has the more like a tendency to shy away from that, to produce something that's more generic, more abstract, that does not attempt to express anything personal. And I think you're really at the other end of the spectrum. And I'm very sympathetic to that. And yeah, so that's, I would look at Matthew Barney and see how you could take your video and his artwork and then somehow mash the two together and produce architecture and space, there's spatial experience out of that.
I agree with this.
I'm sorry, Analia, go ahead.
No, sorry, I have to agree with that completely. I feel like it's the type of situation where something so personal can become universal. I mean, like the look within can be like the look without. And I posted the work of Camille Henrot. I mean, I think she's an amazing French contemporary artist. She won the Venice Biennial Golden Lion like a few years ago for this video called Grosse Fatigue. But so that's a video that she did. She was at the Smithsonian for a year and she was accumulating all this knowledge and she made this video. But she's also very good at like making exhibitions with actual objects where you actually see like the space become this type of like almost looks like virtual and a collage of objects, but you know, it's a space where you like walk in. And I mean, I think the fact that, you know, this is inevitable, the fact that we're going into a virtual world like we're doing today, and it will continue this way. So like the more control over the aesthetics of that world, and the more like thought that, you know, we put into, and I think that's what, you know, this project is so important, because you're really like embracing, I'm not saying it's a good thing for society, you know, but on the other hand, like it will happen regardless. So like the fact that you can embrace it and that you are including so many objects. I mean, like you went through like the history of all these different chairs, and, you know, you're really like thinking so much about what an object is and what a space is. The fact that you are sitting in it and you're like creating, you know, that moment when you're like sitting at your desk yourself, but of course we don't even see you. You see the back of you, which is like what we see of each other, like the back of us, because we're looking at the computer. And then you start like drawing this video, and it's happening kind of inside the room. I mean, I think I just don't want anything to stop you, because it gives so much to think about. It really does. And the more you go in it, like the more we can reflect on these times and, you know, the consequences on us.
I thought that was a really wonderful comment as well. And I think the reference to Sohn is brilliant, because of course, Sohn is famous for creating fictional narratives around his own work. He would go back and he would do fictions about coming across the ruins of his house in the future, you know, and thinking about it as some kind of future archaeologist or even geologist after the current civilization of the world had passed. And, you know, that the idea that architecture has to be universal is a very narrow one, and one that you can break easily over the knee of architectural history. So I think you should be, what I'm challenging you to do is to feel fully enfranchised, to take your identity and your perspective and your narrative and push it into every architectural aspect that we know now and will know in the future, right? Don't just keep it in the penumbra of things relating to representation, because although you're right, that's an important part of what we do, it's not all that we do. And yes, 100%, you could keep developing this as the amazing gallery-ready art piece that it is. But that's not the only thing that you could develop. You could also take it back into the physical realm and think about all of the ways that you've already manipulated and challenged the status of objects, related them to subjectivity, and how you might translate that into something at the build scale. Because you know what, I guess last point, I'm sorry, I know I'm rambling on, but Richard, the world needs difference. We need architecture that's radically different than what we have. I don't want you to just abandon it and go off and do other stuff, although I'm really glad that you're pushing on the boundaries of the field. I also want you to contribute, because we desperately need people like you in this field.
I was really interested, Richard, in the way you structured your thesis as a kind of, you know, in the first section, you were showing some kind of how you catalog, let's say, manhood, you know, and that cataloged manhood and a bit of a critique on that, yeah, and how you do it and how there's a background and a foreground and how you create that. And then I think and that's how I interpret it. I'm sure maybe you wrote it in your description. But then you kind of moved on to another part, which is less about, you know, an art piece, but more about showing us different tools. And so what made you choose that kind of structure? Because on the one hand, I can, you know, the idea of a catalog as a tool to interpret architecture through, you know, and then using foreground and background and kind of multiplying these effects, you know, instead of the traditional architectural way. So you choose something, you know, it's very intimate, very personal, but also very very much your critique of manhood, let's say, and then you apply it to kind of a mode of representation rather than an architecture. Yeah. And so, it's very interesting what's made you think about it, because, I've seen many theses where you just want to present your thesis. You don't want to present two theses. And it seems to me like this is kind of a doubling. So I'm just wondering what's the logic?
Oh, well, I don't know if it's so much a doubling of two kind of perhaps distinct ideas as much as it's seeing kind of the designer as the character again and positioning that individual within chapters.
Mm-hmm.
But going to the masculinity at the beginning, the perfect boyfriend builder, the title of the thesis is a kind of cheeky, lighthearted way, I suppose, to investigate some of these topics. Maybe not so lighthearted.
Well, I think we're running out our clock.
Can I say
so
one? Can I say one quick thing, David?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. I hesitated to put like Peter Berlin as a reference in the chat. The only reason why I did it is because of this last comment that you said, Richard, where I think it's like ultimately a commentary about like us as designers, almost like coming into the field, this kind of idea that you're showing your project through like initially a sense of inadequacy, wrong drawing, then finding like how you want to do the thing. Like there's something about talking about the designer as the character in order to talk about the discipline. So I don't know what building it produces, but maybe there's a little bit of a conversation about what kind of architect it might produce or what kind of designer it might produce. So I'm really relating to that comment that you said at the end. And I hesitated to put Peter Berlin, but the reason why I did is because he's kind of a little bit too perfect of an encapsulation of your project. He was the perfect boyfriend on the streets. That was like his porn character, his streets character was like your ideal human. He would present himself that way. He was the one that everybody wanted to be with and look at. And yet his home, so I'm now serving you a new zone character. His home was complete with knickknacks everywhere. Walls were knickknacks, plants were hanging everywhere. Every single surface was covered with like gifts from friends and posters and photos of himself. So the kind of shrine to himself, the perfection of the boyfriendness that he was his own boyfriend, was like manifested in his archiving of his own legacy and of his like ideal selfness in his home in New York. And in order to encounter a little bit more of that, I would look at, it's not a film that's available online, but maybe you can do a little bit of groundwork and find it. It's called Encounters I May or May Not Have Had with Peter Berlin by an LA artist, Mariah Garnett. She's the person that got closest to documenting his apartment life. So that, she might have a good clip for you on the sort of house as archive, house as museum condition. Awesome work. Beautiful project, Richard.
Thank you.
On that note, Richard, it was a real pleasure to work with you this summer. I think the project leaves a lot for you to continue to work on, and it feels a bit like a masterpiece that one has a million questions about, but it adds up to something much more than the sum of its parts in a way. And all the discussion today, I think, is something we've been talking about this whole summer, the personal architecture, etc. So I want to congratulate you just on the amount of effort you put into this and to pull it off and everything. So congrats. I want to thank all our guests for coming today. Congrats to all the students, to the students that already presented earlier, Hiral, WANGSHU, and ERWIN, and to Richard. Thank you for coming. if anyone wants to say hello or goodbye, I think that's going to be it. But congratulations, everyone. I'm going to just do a little, by myself, a little round of applause here for all of you.
Thank you, and nice to see you, everybody.
Nice. Thank you for coming, Lydia.
Thank you,
Cool.
Kivi, Lydia, for coming from far.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Lydia.
Bye, everyone. Super good work.
Bye.
Yeah, good to see everyone.
Great work. Congratulations.
Congrats, everyone.
Great work, everyone.
Where do we go?